August 17, 1943. 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiral into the Pacific below. 3 Japanese Zeros had bounced them from above. Now Bong was alone. The lead Zero closed on his tail. He had perhaps 4 seconds before 20mm cannon fire tore through his aircraft, and next wasn't in any training manual. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from the threat, the aircraft dove toward the ocean. But because he was upside down, he pulled away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated, rushed to his head. His vision went red at the edges. The Pacific Ocean filled his canopy where the sky should have been. The Zero pilot, expecting Bong to climb, overshot. In those 3 seconds of confusion, Bong rolled upright below the Zero and pulled up hard. His .50 caliber machine guns raked the Zero's belly from a position no Japanese pilot had ever encountered. An American fighter attacking from below. The Zero disintegrated. By August 1943, American pilots in the Pacific faced a brutal reality. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. Japanese pilots exploited this advantage ruthlessly. Standard doctrine called for American fighters to use their superior speed and firepower. Dive, shoot, climb away, never turn with the Zero. The numbers told the grim story. In the first year of Pacific air combat, the Zero maintained a kill ratio of nearly 3-to-1 against American fighters. The A6M0 could turn inside a circle roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 at combat speeds. When an American pilot tried to dogfight, the Zero simply turned harder and positioned for the kill. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch documented the problem in his August 1943 after-action report. Our pilots maintain speed advantage but cannot engage in sustained combat. The moment we slow down or turn, the Zero has us. We trade 1 kill for every losses in turning fights. The P-38 Lightning brought advantages. Twin Allison engines producing 2 600 horsepower combined, a top speed of 414 miles per hour. 4-ton 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose. A P-38 pilot who kept his speed could devastate Zeros in a single pass. But combat rarely allowed perfect conditions. Japanese pilots have been fighting since the late 1930s over China. They understood energy management at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. A common Japanese tactic involved 1 Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, 2 more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. The American fighter was suddenly defensive, and defensive meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zero's advantages became overwhelming. What Bong stumbled onto that day over Solomon Islands was something aviation medicine considered impossible. The maneuver involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed toward their feet, vision narrows at around 5 to 6 Gs. Many pilots experience gray out or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. The effect is called redoubt because the visual literally turns red as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely. But these studies were conducted in controlled environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. Combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of redoubt vision but escaping a Zero's gun solution survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable versus permanent death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a tail position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risked structural failure or engine problems because the aircraft systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines which could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines use fuel systems that function more reliably under negative G loads. This wasn't a design feature. Lockheed engineers weren't planning for inverted combat tactics, but it became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive, while some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, widening the separation. The human body's tolerance for negative G-forces turned out to be higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots reported that the redoubt effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split-S maneuver. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G. Flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense. Headaches, facial fatigue, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted in debriefings that they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than receive a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby in New Guinea, became one of the first pilots to deliberately use the inverted dive tactic rather than discovering it by instinct. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a four-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his formation encountered 8 Japanese Zeros at high altitude. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive and accelerated rapidly as gravity converted altitude into speed. The aircraft screamed downward through the thin air. The Zero pilot tried to follow, but the dive angle was too aggressive. The P-38 gathered speed faster than the lighter Zero could safely handle. Within seconds, Lynch had created distance between himself and the pursuing fighter. He leveled out thousands of feet lower, still traveling at tremendous speed. Now the situation had changed. Instead of being the hunted aircraft with an enemy on his tail, Lynch possessed energy, speed, and separation. Those three elements gave him the initiative. He pulled his Lightning into a climb, converting speed back into altitude. Above him, the Japanese formation had become disorganized. Several Zeros had chased the diving Americans, losing formation discipline. Lynch climbed back toward them from below. That approach direction was unusual in Pacific air combat. Most attacks came from above, where altitude gave an advantage. But Lynch used the chaos created by the dive to approach from beneath the enemy aircraft. When he closed the distance, fired. The concentrated nose guns of the P-38 proved devastating. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon struck the underside of the first Zero. The fighter burst into flames. Moments later, Lynch destroyed another. His wingmen, who had followed him through the inverted dive, survived the encounter without losses. The after-action report noted the maneuver but treated it cautiously. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G flight because of the medical risks, but Lynch recognized something important. This wasn't luck, it was a repeatable technique. Within days, he began explaining the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron. The instruction was straightforward. If a Zero gains a tail position and conventional maneuvers fail, roll inverted, pull through into a steep dive, and use gravity to create separation. Don't try to outturn the Zero, use the vertical dimension instead. American fighters were faster in dives. They could build speed more quickly than the Japanese aircraft. The Zero dominated the horizontal circle, but American aircraft dominated the vertical dive. By the early summer of 1943, this idea began spreading informally among P-38 units operating from Guadalcanal and nearby islands. Pilots discussed the tactic in ready rooms after missions. They compared experiences and refined the technique. Because the maneuver contradicted official training guidance, it remained unofficial. Squadron commanders understood its value but hesitated. Included informal manuals. If a pilot died attempting the maneuver, responsibility could become complicated, so the tactic spread the way many combat innovations spray, word of mouth. Experienced pilots demonstrated it to new arrivals during training flights. They described the physical sensations, the red vision, the pressure in the head, and the brief disorientation, but they also explained the outcome, hitting the effect pilots experience when performing these maneuvers. Flight Surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, started recording cases of pilots who reported redoubt during combat. His research eventually examined 17 pilots who had executed inverted dives during engagements with Japanese fighters. Every one of them described the same visual phenomenon. Within 1 or 2 seconds of pulling negative G-forces, the edges of their vision turned red. The redness spread inward as blood rushed toward the head. Most pilots retained enough central vision to maintain control of the aircraft for 3 to 5 seconds. That was enough time to complete the maneuver. After landing, the physical effects were obvious. Tiny red spots called petechiae appeared on the skin, especially around the eyes and forehead. These marks came from small capillaries that burst under increased pressure. Pilots complained of severe headaches lasting several hours. Their eyes appeared bloodshot. Some reported temporary blurred vision. One pilot experienced double vision that lasted half a day before disappearing completely. Despite these symptoms, Moorhead discovered something surprising. None of the pilots suffered permanent injury. Repeated exposure didn't seem to worsen the effects either. Pilots who performed the maneuver multiple times experienced the same short-term symptoms but showed no cumulative damage. The human body proved more resilient than early aviation medical studies had predicted. The key factor was duration. Negative G exposure lasting only a few seconds produced dramatic but temporary effects. Longer exposure could still be dangerous, but combat maneuvers rarely required more than 3 to 5 seconds. This medical evidence slowly confirmed what combat pilots already suspected. The maneuver was uncomfortable, but it wasn't fatal, and compared to the alternative, the choice was obvious. By late 1943, the inverted dive had quietly become standard practice among several P-38 units. Pilots didn't always discuss it openly in official briefings, but everyone knew about it. The tactical balance in the Pacific Air War also began shifting around this time. American aircraft production increased dramatically. New fighters arrived in greater numbers. Pilot training improved. The Zeros that once dominated the skies faced opponents who understood how to exploit their weaknesses. Japanese pilots noticed the difference. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous fighter aces, later wrote about encountering American pilots who refused to fight in traditional turning engagements. Instead of circling horizontally, they rolled inverted and dove away at high speed. When Japanese fighters attempted to follow, the Americans sometimes reversed direction and attacked from unexpected angles. This tactic created psychological frustration. For years, Zero pilots relied on their aircraft's exceptional turning ability to dominate opponents, but if the opponent refused to turn, that advantage disappeared. The inverted dive transformed what should have been a kill opportunity into a missed chance. Sometimes it even reversed the situation entirely. An engagement recorded by Lieutenant Robert Westbrook of the 475th Fighter Group illustrated this change clearly. His 4-plane patrol encountered 9 Japanese Zeros while flying at medium altitude. The Zeros possessed the advantage and dove toward the American formation. American pilots might have broken into horizontal turns to evade the attack, but Westbrook and his wingmen did something different. All 4 P-38 pilots rolled inverted at nearly the same moment. They pulled through into steep dives. The Japanese fighters overshot their targets, expecting the Americans to turn rather than dive. As the Lightnings accelerated downward, their speed increased dramatically. Within seconds, they created distance between themselves and the Zeros. At lower altitude, the American formation leveled out, regrouped, and climbed again. Now they possessed the advantage: speed, energy, position. When the fight resumed, the Americans shot down several Zeros without losing a single aircraft. Westbrook credited the inverted dive with saving his formation from what could have been a disastrous encounter. The tactic worked because it exploited several factors simultaneously. It increased speed, it created altitude separation, it disrupted the enemy expectations, and it leveraged aircraft design differences that favored the American fighter in vertical maneuvers. But perhaps the most important factor was psychological. American pilots became willing to endure several seconds of severe discomfort if it meant surviving the encounter. Once they accepted that temporary redoubt wouldn't kill them, the maneuver became far less intimidating. Japanese pilots faced a different calculation. Their aircraft handled poorly under negative G level. Attempting to follow American fighters through steep inverted dives risked mechanical problems or structural stress. As a result, many Japanese pilots simply refused to pursue. That decision alone made the tactic successful. Its purpose wasn't always to destroy the enemy aircraft. Sometimes simply escaping the engagement was victory enough. By early 1944, units fully embracing vertical combat tactics began achieving dramatically improved results. One fighter group reported a kill ratio that reversed the earlier disadvantage. Where American pilots once lost 3 aircraft for every Japanese fighter destroyed, they now achieved the opposite. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed for every American loss. The change didn't come from a single technological breakthrough. It came from tactical adaptation. Pilots learned to fight in ways that maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. And the inverted dive became one of the key tools in that tactical evolution. By early 1944, the tactical balance in the Pacific Air War had shifted dramatically. American fighter squadrons that embraced vertical combat tactics began reporting far better results. The inverted dive was no longer an unusual improvisation used only by a few daring pilots. It had become a quiet but powerful element of everyday combat survival. Pilots arriving from training units quickly learned about it from veterans. Sometimes the lesson happened in the ready room before a mission. Sometimes it happened in the air during practice flights. Experienced pilots would take a newcomer up and demonstrate the maneuver in controlled conditions. They explained what the young pilot would feel: the rush of blood to the head, the sudden red tint creeping across the edges of vision, the pounding pressure behind the eyes. They also explained something even more important: the effect would pass. Vision would return once the aircraft returned to positive G flight. The pain might linger for a while, but the pilot would still be alive. For men flying daily combat missions, that knowledge was reassuring. It transformed something frightening into something manageable. At the same time, flight surgeons continued studying the physiological effects of negative G-forces. The early wartime reports written by Captain James Moorhead were expanded as more data became available. Medical officers across Pacific air bases compared notes and observations. They discovered that pilots who performed inverted dives seemed to tolerate the maneuver better over time. The body adapted, blood vessels strengthened slightly, pilots learned to brace themselves before initiating the maneuver. They controlled their breathing and posture to minimize discomfort. Experienced pilots often recovered their vision faster than newcomers. What once seemed like a dangerous experiment slowly became an understood physiological response. By mid-1944, negative G exposure lasting a few seconds was no longer considered medically mysterious. It was simply another stress that fighter pilots learned to endure. The tactical benefits continued proving themselves in combat. Japanese fighter pilots were among the best trained aviators in the world during the early years of the war. Many had thousands of flight hours and years of combat experience, but their aircraft design imposed limitations. The Zero achieved incredible maneuverability through extremely light construction. It sacrificed armor protection and structural strength to achieve tight turning ability. That design philosophy worked beautifully in horizontal dogfights. It worked less well in steep vertical maneuvers. Attempting to follow a diving P-38 at very high speed placed stress on the Zero structure. Its wings were not designed for prolonged high-speed dives or heavy negative G loads. Japanese pilots knew this. As more American pilots adopted vertical escape tactics, Japanese fighters often chose to break off pursuit rather than risk struck damage or loss of control. That hesitation changed the psychology of air combat. Instead of confidently pressing attacks, Zero pilots began approaching American formations more cautiously. They still held advantages in some situations, but the dominance they enjoyed in the early war years was fading. The inverted dive did more than save individual pilots. It helped reshape how American fighter pilots thought about combat. Earlier training emphasized strict adherence to doctrine, taught specific maneuvers, and expected to follow them closely. But combat proved more unpredictable than training scenarios. Pilots who survived multiple missions learned that flexibility mattered more than rigid procedure. The inverted dive became a symbol of that flexibility. It reminded pilots that sometimes the correct answer was not the one written in a manual. Sometimes survival required doing something unexpected. The tactic also reinforced a broader concept that would later become fundamental in fighter aviation: energy management. Altitude, speed, and maneuvering capability form a system of energy that pilots constantly trade back and forth during combat. Altitude can become speed during a dive. Speed can become altitude during a climb. A pilot who manages energy better than his opponent usually gains the advantage. The inverted dive exploited this principle perfectly. Instead of wasting energy trying to outturn a more maneuverable aircraft, the American pilot converted altitude directly into speed. That speed created distance. Distance created safety. Safety created the opportunity to reposition and counterattack. Once pilots understood this concept, they began applying it to other maneuvers as well. Vertical loops, climbing turns, high-speed diving passes all became part of a new style of combat, emphasizing energy advantage instead of turning ability. The transformation spread beyond P-38 units. Pilots flying other American fighters, including the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang, adopted similar ideas even if the specific maneuver differed. The principle remained the same: use the aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's strengths, fight the battle in the dimension where your aircraft performs best. By the final year of the war, American fighter doctrine in the Pacific reflected these lessons. Training materials began cautiously mentioning negative G maneuvers as emergency techniques. The language remained conservative, but the message was clear. Pilots were allowed to use the maneuver when necessary. In practice, that meant it became widely accepted. Combat veterans continued refining the technique. Some pilots experimented with partial rolls before entering the dive, reducing the intensity of negative G exposure. Others combined the maneuver with barrel rolls or quick directional changes during the recovery phase, making their flight path even harder for enemy pilots to predict. Every combat encounter provided new data. Pilots compared experiences, discussed tactics, and gradually improved the technique. This informal process created a kind of evolutionary development. Maneuvers that worked spread quickly, maneuvers that failed disappeared. The inverted dive survived because it consistently produced results. By the end of the war, the P-38 Lightning had established itself as one of the most effective long-range fighters in the Pacific. Pilots flying the aircraft accumulated impressive victory totals. Among them was Richard Bong. The young pilot who once improvised an inverted dive to escape a Zero continued flying combat missions throughout the war. His skill, aggressiveness, and understanding of air combat tactics made him extraordinarily successful. Mission after mission, Bong engaged Japanese aircraft across the vast distances of the Pacific theater. He fought over jungles, oceans, and island chains scattered across thousands of miles. Each encounter sharpened his instincts, each victory increased his reputation among fellow pilots. By the time he completed his combat tour, Richard Bong had achieved something no other American fighter pilot had accomplished: 40 confirmed aerial victories. That total made him the highest-scoring American ace of World War II. Yet among the pilots who flew beside him, Bong was known less for his record than for his calm personality and willingness to share tactical insights. He understood something many successful pilots eventually realized: air combat was rarely about individual heroics. It was about learning faster than the enemy. The inverted dive represented exactly that kind of learning. A small idea discovered under pressure, tested repeatedly in combat, and passed from one pilot to another until it became part of the collective knowledge of fighter aviation. And that knowledge would not disappear when the war ended. The principles behind the maneuver energy management, vertical maneuvering, and tactical unpredictability would shape fighter combat for decades to come. New aircraft would appear, jet engines would replace propellers, missiles would supplement machine guns, but the basic physics of air combat would remain the same. Altitude could still become speed, speed could still become altitude. And sometimes the fastest way to escape danger would still involve rolling upside down and diving toward the earth. When the Second World War ended, many people believed the era of traditional dogfighting might also be ended. Engines were replacing propellers, aircraft were becoming dramatically faster, radar and guided missiles promised to change air combat forever. The lessons learned during the war did not disappear. Veteran pilots carried those lessons into the next generation of aviation. The principles that men like Richard Bong and Thomas Lynch had discovered in the skies over the Pacific would soon face another test. Only a few years after the war ended, conflict erupted again. This time it was over the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War introduced the world to jet-powered air combat on a large scale. Two aircraft in particular defined the conflict in the air. On one side was the American F-86 Sabre. On the other was the Soviet-designed MiG-15, flown by North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots. Both aircraft were revolutionary compared to the propeller fighters of World War II. They climbed faster, flew higher, and reached speeds approaching the sound barrier. Yet despite the enormous technological leap, many aspects of aerial combat remained surprisingly familiar. The MiG-15 possessed several advantages over the F-86 in certain flight conditions. It could climb more quickly and often turn tighter at high altitudes. The Sabre, however, had advantages of its own. It handled better at high speeds and provided superior stability in diving maneuvers. Once again, pilots found themselves facing a familiar tactical dilemma. When the enemy had an advantage in turning ability, engaging in horizontal dogfights could be dangerous. The answer once again involved the vertical dimension. F-86 pilots discovered that steep dives and vertical maneuvers allowed them to escape dangerous situations and regain energy advantages. Just as P-38 pilots had done years earlier, Sabre pilots often rolled inverted and dove away when MiGs attempted to close from behind. The sudden change in flight path disrupted the enemy pilot's expectations. It forced the MiG pilot to decide instantly whether to follow. That decision was rarely simple. Jet engines of the early 1950s did not always respond well to negative G-forces. Fuel systems could experience interruptions if the aircraft remained inverted too long. As a result, both sides learned to keep negative G maneuvers brief. 3 or 4 seconds could create enough separation without risking engine failure. One of the most successful American pilots of the Korean War was Captain Joseph McConnell. Flying the F-86 Sabre, McConnell eventually became the leading American ace of the conflict with 16 confirmed victories. In several of his engagements, McConnell described using steep inverted dives to escape unfavorable positions against MiG fighters. He later explained the tactic simply. When the enemy expected you to turn, you changed direction vertically. The maneuver bought time. Time allowed you to rebuild speed. Speed allowed you to regain control of the fight. Once again, the physics of aerial combat proved remarkably consistent. Aircraft technology changed, weapons evolved, but gravity, energy, and human reaction time remained the same. The lessons carried forward into later conflicts as well. During the Vietnam War, American pilots flying the F-4 Phantom encountered another challenge. The Phantom was a powerful and advanced aircraft designed primarily as a missile platform for long-range engagements. Early in the war, many military planners believed traditional dogfighting would become obsolete. Missiles would destroy enemy aircraft long before pilots could see each other. Reality proved different. Rules of engagement often required pilots to visually identify targets before firing. Missile technology of the time was less reliable than expected. As a result, many engagements occurred at close range, and at close range maneuverability mattered again. North Vietnamese MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters were smaller and often more agile than the large F-4 Phantom. American pilots suddenly found themselves in situations that resembled earlier wars. course. When trapped in a turning fight, the Phantom could struggle against lighter opponents. The answer once again involved vertical maneuvering. Pilots rediscovered techniques that had existed since World War II. Among them were steep diving escapes and brief negative G maneuvers designed to break an opponent's attack. One famous example occurred on May 10, 1972. Navy Lieutenant Randy Cunningham and his radar intercept officer Willie Driscoll were flying an F-4 Phantom during a major air battle over North Vietnam. During the engagement, they encountered several MiG-17 fighters. At one point, a MiG briefly gained a favorable position behind them. Cunningham reacted by executing a sharp vertical maneuver, including an inverted dive designed to break the enemy pilot's firing solution. The tactic worked, the MiG overshot. Moments later, Cunningham reversed the situation and shot down the pursuing aircraft. By the end of the mission, he had destroyed 3 MiGs, making him the first American ace of the Vietnam War. The experience reinforced an important lesson for the U.S. Navy. Many of the close-range combat skills that earlier generations of pilots had mastered were no longer emphasized in training. To correct this problem, the Navy established a new program in 1969, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known by its famous nickname, Top Gun. The purpose of Top Gun was simple: teach fighter pilots how to win aerial combat. Instructors studied the experiences of pilots from World War II, Korea, and early Vietnam missions. They examined what worked and what failed. They analyzed how aircraft performance interacted with pilot decision-making, and they emphasized energy management and vertical maneuvering as core principles of fighter tactics. Negative G maneuvers became part of the curriculum. Students learned the physiological effects of redoubt and practiced inverted maneuvers in controlled conditions. The goal was not to encourage reckless flying. The goal was to ensure that pilots understood the full capabilities of their aircraft and their own bodies. When used correctly, a brief negative G dive could disrupt an enemy's attack, break radar lock, and create opportunities for counterattack. Top Gun dramatically improved American air combat performance during the later years of the Vietnam War. Kill ratios against enemy fighters increased significantly. The lessons learned decades earlier in the skies over the Pacific had returned once again. Technology continued advancing through the late 20th century. New fighters such as the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon introduced fly-by-wire control systems, powerful engines, and improved avionics. These aircraft were designed from the beginning with energy maneuverability in mind. Engineers understood that pilots needed to perform aggressive vertical maneuvers during combat. Fuel systems, structural strength, and control systems were designed to handle a wide range of flight attitudes, including inverted flight. The F-16 in particular became famous for its ability to perform high-energy maneuvers in both positive and negative G environments. Pilots flying the aircraft could sustain aggressive dives, rapid rolls, and extreme maneuvering without worrying about engine failure or fuel starvation. Training programs also evolved. Modern fighter pilots now experience controlled G-force exposure during centrifuge training. This equipment allows pilots to feel the effects of both positive and negative G-forces in a safe environment. They learn how their bodies react. They learn how to maintain awareness during intense maneuvers. And they learn that the strange visual effects gray out, blackout, and redoubt are temporary physiological responses rather than signs of catastrophic danger. By the late 20th century, negative G flight was no longer viewed as a mysterious or forbidden maneuver. It had become another tool in the tactical toolkit of fighter aviation. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, fighter aircraft had reached levels of performance that early pilots could hardly imagine. Modern jets could fly faster than twice the speed of sound. They carried sophisticated radar systems capable of detecting targets dozens of miles away. Missiles guided by advanced electronics could strike enemy aircraft long before the pilots ever saw each other. At first glance, it seemed like the age of close-range maneuvering was finally ending. But once again, reality proved more complicated. Even with advanced missiles and sensors, air combat still involved uncertainty. Electronic countermeasures could disrupt radar signals. Missiles could miss their targets. Clouds, terrain, and confusion could force pilots into close-range engagements. And when aircraft close to visual range, the basic physics of aerial combat still applied. Altitude remained energy, speed remained energy, gravity still influenced every maneuver. Modern fighters like the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F/A-18 Hornet, and later the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II were designed with these realities in mind. Their engines produced enormous thrust. Their structures could withstand extreme forces. Their control systems allowed pilots to maneuver aggressively while maintaining stability. Fuel systems were engineered to function in almost any orientation. Inverted flight, steep dives, and rapid rolls were no longer dangerous improvisations. They were expected parts of combat maneuvering. Pilots trained extensively to understand the physical limits of both their aircraft and their own bodies. During centrifuge training, aviators experience the crushing pressure of high positive G-forces that push blood toward the feet. They also learned about negative G-forces that send blood rushing toward the head. Although modern fighters rarely require prolonged negative G maneuvers, pilots still practice inverted dives and aggressive directional changes. The reason is simple. Unpredictability remains one of the most powerful weapons in air combat. An enemy pilot attempting to track your aircraft relies on anticipation. He predicts your next movement based on common tactics and aerodynamic logic. His expectations, his firing solution dissipates in a way that contradicts his expectations. His firing solution disappears. Even a moment of confusion can be enough to break a missile lock or force an overshoot. That sense, the inverted dive discovered by World War II pilots still represents a fundamental truth. Sometimes survival depends on doing the unexpected. Modern fighter doctrine describes this concept using the language of energy maneuverability and situational awareness. Pilots constantly evaluate their altitude, speed, and relative position compared to the enemy. They decide when to attack, when to evade, and when to disengage. Those decisions happen in seconds. Often they happen instinctively. The instincts themselves are built through training and experience. Instructors remind students that technology does not eliminate the human element of combat. Radar systems provide information, missiles provide reach. But the pilot still controls the aircraft, and the pilot's judgment determines whether an engagement ends in victory or disaster. The history of aerial combat is filled with examples where quick thinking and creative maneuvering saved lives. Many of those examples involve simple physical principles rather than advanced technology, gravity, momentum, energy. These forces governed the earliest dogfights of World War I and continue influencing modern jet combat. The inverted dive remains a perfect illustration of how pilots adapt to those forces. It began as an improvised reaction to a dangerous situation. A pilot facing an enemy behind him needed a way to escape. The maneuver was painful. The redoubt effect caused blood to rush into the eyes, turning crimson and disorienting the pilot for several seconds. Medical experts initially believed such conditions were unsafe, but combat pilots evaluated the risk differently. A few seconds of discomfort were acceptable if they meant survival. Once the maneuver proved successful, it spread from pilot to pilot. Squadrons adopted it informally. Medical officers studied it. Training programs eventually incorporated it. Over time, it became part of the broader understanding of aerial combat. This pattern has repeated many times in aviation history. Pilots experiment. Some ideas fail, others succeed and gradually become doctrine. Innovation often begins with individuals facing immediate danger and improvising solutions. The skies over the Pacific during World War II provided many such moments. Young men flying fragile machines thousands of miles from home were forced to make life or death decisions every day. Their experiences produced lessons that influenced fighter aviation for generations. Among those pilots, Richard Bong remains one of the most remarkable figures. By the end of his combat tour, he had destroyed 40 enemy aircraft, making him the highest-scoring American ace of World War II. Yet Bong never viewed himself as a legend. He described his victories modestly, often crediting teamwork, training, and luck. After returning to the United States in 1944, Bong became involved in testing new aircraft. The war in the Pacific continued, but his role had shifted from frontline combat to helping improve future aviation technology. Tragically, his life ended only months after the war. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Richard Bong was flying a test mission in a new jet aircraft, the Lockheed P-38's Shooting Star. Shortly after takeoff from an airfield in California, the aircraft experienced mechanical trouble. Bong attempted to bail out, but the parachute failed to deploy in time. He died at the age of 24. His loss shocked the aviation community. A pilot who had survived dozens of combat missions against enemy fighters was killed during a routine test flight at home. But his legacy endured. The lessons learned by pilots like Bong helped shape the tactics and training of future generations. Their experiences influenced how fighter pilots understood energy, maneuverability, and the human limits of flight. Today, advanced fighter aircraft carry weapons and sensors that early aviators could never have imagined. But the sky itself has not changed. Gravity still pulls aircraft downward. Speed still determines maneuvering potential. And pilots still rely on creativity and courage when faced with danger. Somewhere in that long history of aerial combat lies the moment when a young pilot rolled his aircraft upside down and dove toward the ocean to escape an enemy fighter. For a few seconds, his vision turned red. Blood rushed to his head. The maneuver hurt, but it worked. And sometimes in combat, that is all that matters.